Hello, my name is Prakash. I'm a professor at Tuskegee University in Alabama. I've been invited by Professor Goldberg to deliver a lecture in his class, which we collaboratively do, the genetics honors course. And I'm delighted to participate in this online course as a supplement to that. What I want to talk today is to examine how biotechnology, specifically agricultural biotechnology, with emphasis on genetically modified crops, to examine how this technology is impacting the developing world and how it might play a more even greater role in the future. Why do we need biotechnology? Why there is a relevance for this technology in the developing world? The most important reason is that in the developing world, there is a great need for improvement in food security. There is a much greater need on identifying tools to improve agricultural production and to improve food quality and to bring about an enhancement in the nutritive value of the food that is eaten in the so-called third world. And the reason is very simple. In this world of 7 billion, um, even though technologically we are so advanced today in the 21st century, yet it's a grim fact that a billion people go to bed hungry every day. Almost 30,000 people, half of them children, die every day due to hunger and malnutrition. And there's also a very high increase in the food prices that we have seen in the past few years that has caused considerable turmoil in some of the countries. And so those of us who are in agricultural science and those policymakers who are interested in seeking solutions to the problems faced by the developing countries, the number one issue is really one of food security. The problem of hunger and malnutrition in the developing world is due to a variety of reasons. Most importantly, people are hungry in many of these countries because they are too poor to buy food. But it's also a very complex area of factors like poor governance, low agricultural productivity, and poor infrastructure in many of these developing countries. Added to that, the issue of conflicts in some place, infectious diseases, and even access to international markets all cause hunger and malnutrition. And the technology, specifically biotechnology, can address only one of the issues here. It can address the problem of low agricultural productivity and obviously much of the other larger issues, the social political dimensions of hunger is beyond the reach of this technology. But nevertheless, when we look at why there is low agricultural productivity in certain countries in the world, primarily in countries that are located in sub-Saharan Africa and also in South Asia, it is due to a variety of reasons. Much of it is environmental and geographic, like the soils are poor in many parts of this world. They have a very very narrow surface soil, low fertility, unfavorable environments. And a lot of those are small holdings where farmers are too poor to engage in modern farm management, use very little of chemical fertilizers, for instance. And also, we have the issue of diseases and pests and weeds. They take away almost 30 to 40% of the farm produce even before they are harvested. And then again, in many of these countries, we don't have good infrastructure that one takes for granted in this country. Here in the United States, for instance, there is very poor storage, especially fruits and vegetables perish. About 50% of the fruits and vegetables perish and rot away after they're harvested in the developing world because of lack of cold storage and refrigerated transportation and food processing industries. So As the world moves forward from 7 billion that we have today to 9 billion in the next 20, 30 years, it is the challenge of feeding the world is going to get even more difficult. Experts predict that countries in Africa have to increase their food production threefold compared to what they are doing now. And even in grain baskets like United States, Australia, and Canada, uh, experts predict that we need to increase the food production by 30, 40% or even more, simply because uh, the other countries such as China and India are getting increasingly prosperous and developing more sophisticated eating habits, and also are able to import much of the food from outside. And when we look at this complex issue of hunger and malnutrition, we should also remind ourselves that oftentimes, while there is plenty of food in the world, it does not necessarily get distributed evenly. And it is probably one issue that need to be addressed. But what is important to recognize is that it is far more complex to distribute the food around the world. And also, a lot of food that we grow in the United States, like corn and soybean, for instance, they are fed to livestock here. 90% of these two crops goes for feeding the livestock, and it is not just easy for us to stop feeding the livestock and take that food and then export it elsewhere. That export and also the food aid is important, but only as emergency measures. But those countries in Kenya or Bangladesh or Burma, where much of the population is agrarian, depending on agriculture for their livelihood, a way to increase agricultural productivity in a sustainable manner without having to increase our use of land for agriculture or using and also to see how we can come up with creative way to grow more food with less water and even using less chemicals is going to be very, very important. In the US, if you look into the history, we've been managed to increase food production in the last 50 years from 250 million tons to almost 750 million tons today. And we have done that by embracing principles of science and actively applying that in a technological manner and developing better varieties of crop plants, trying to improve our soil fertility, using mechanization and control of diseases, pests, and weeds in an efficient manner. They've all helped us to improve food production. And even in the developing world, in the past 40 years, the so-called Green Revolution helped improve food production in China from 100 to 450 million tons in the past 50 years. And India has done the same. And what is important is that as we move forward now, we must examine how we can explore even more modern tools of genetics and specifically genetic engineering to increase such food production, and especially in Africa, because Green Revolution bypassed Africa more or less, and current levels of food production in Africa is something like 20%, 30% of what you find in other developed countries such as those in Europe or in North America. And so there is a great potential to improve food production in Africa and also in South Asia. One important tool that can help us do is the science of genetic engineering. And while genetic engineering is new and it's been in use only in the past, say, 20 years in agriculture, what is important to recognize is that we have used similar tools for modifying our crop plants for thousands of years. Almost every food crop that we grow today was once a weed, and our forefathers and foremothers, when our ancestors, when they started practicing agriculture, they domesticate some of these weeds into crop plants and then continuously changed it in so much so that none of our present day crops today, when you look at rice or when you look at maize or wheat, they do not resemble the wild ancestors from which they were derived. Kind of very similar to when you look at our dog breeds today, the Chihuahuas and the Dachshunds have very little resemblance to the wild wolves from which they were derived. And also, the same token, our domesticated crops, and even animals would not survive in the wild even for one day without the human help. And so, almost all the crops, we have changed it dramatically. The maize a few thousand years ago would have been like a tiny little thin ear like a pencil, and today you find the hybrid corn, the corn on the cob that is so big, and this has contributed to the increase in the yield in many ways. The tomato that we grow today is hundredfold bigger than the tomato that you find in the world, like in Peru, in the Andes Mountains. And so we have used a variety of tools, hybridization, mutation, and cell culture to develop these varieties of crop plants. And this is what we call as a classical breeding. And the modern biotechnology is very similar to that, but is even more precise, and it's kind of like in the earlier days we used to use something like sledgehammer analogy to create genetic variation, and genetic engineering in contrast is more like using a scalpel. It's more precise, and then the results are more predictable, and the changes are very subtle. And so when you take a tomato and genetically modify it to have more nutrition content, or when you take a rice or wheat and make it more resistant to insect. Remember, rice has about 30,000 genes in it already, and we are just adding one or two genes in a way to bring about this change. And those changes are come with a substantial knowledge base. We know what kind of gene we are putting, what does it do into this rice crop or tomato crop, and we study it very intensively in terms of its safety issues and environmental impact, and then only release it for the farmers. And so just like drugs, the biotechnology derived crops have a very large regulatory and safety testing built into that. And we started releasing these crops for commercial cultivation in a very modest way in 1996. And 15 years since then, but these biotech crops are grown in 25 countries across the world, and almost 400 million acres. And what is interesting is even many developing countries now started growing these crops. In fact, the largest group of users of these crops is really the small farmers in the developing world, because an average cotton farm in India is about 2 acres or less than that, and 95% of cotton farmers in India now plant this biotechnology crop. And in addition to cotton, we have soybean, which is the largest planted biotech crop in the world, and we also have, next to that is maize or corn, and then we also have canola and a few other small crops like papaya in very small numbers. And most traits that are planted today, the characters that are modified using biotechnology, is primarily two traits, herbicide tolerance and insect resistance. But there is a great opportunity for us to extend beyond these traits, and especially when you're talking about the developing world. But nevertheless, although the only two traits that have been modified with only 4 crops, biotechnology has already made a substantial impact in agriculture. For instance, the farmers, by planting these crops, have saved almost 400 million kilograms of pesticide. It's almost a billion pounds of pesticides that have not been sprayed, because they are planting these so-called BT crops that are naturally resistant to insects, so you don't have to spray much pesticides. And because of we don't use as much farm machinery or even aircraft and tractors to do these sprays anymore, by use of these biotech crops has led to lower carbon emission and just smaller ecological footprint of farming, and even greater biodiversity in the farming because of less usage of chemicals, and also increased presence of crop and biodiversity on the farm. and it's been estimated almost $65 billion income has been recognized by farmers and companies that have developed these crops. And now, how can biotechnology help the developing world? Because developing world doesn't necessarily eat grow much soybean or canola, and while they do plant much maize, very little of that is planted in the developing world. I do believe in the next 10 years or 15 years, we're going to see much greater impact of technology. This technology will have in many of the developing countries around the world, in South America, in Africa, and then across Asia. And we are going to see one of the most important impact this will have is on decreased use of pesticides on the farm, because if you plant rice or sweet potato, cassava, many of these crops engineered with natural resistance to diseases and pests, farmers do not have to spray much pesticides. And there has been a rampant indiscriminate use of pesticides in many developing countries. It's very common for me to hear that Indian farmers, for instance, spray 40, 50, 60 times on their cabbage and cauliflower and eggplant, and those kinds of vegetables. They're literally drenched in pesticides. And biotechnology here offers a way to practically eliminate or minimize the use of such harmful pesticides. And when we grow such crops that are naturally resistant to pests and diseases, we also not only cut down the use of pesticides, but also by protecting the crop against these harmful agents, we increase its yield. In cotton, for instance, in India, they have seen anywhere from 20 to 30% increase in yield because we eliminate losses by pests and diseases. And another important trait that a lot of scientists are working on is to see how we can improve the nutrient efficiency of the crop plants. In that way, we do not have to apply much fertilizer, because so much of fertilizer that we apply today gets wasted and it does not necessarily get used by the crop plants. And by trying to come up with crop plants that are more efficient in their use of nitrogen fertilizers, phosphorus and potassium, the future farmers will be applying less fertilizers, which means there is less fertilizer runoff and there is less seepage of fertilizer into the natural the rivers and streams, for instance, and thus minimize some of the present-day problems we hear, like algal blooms and then the toxic elements in our soil and water. There is a considerable research that's going on in trying to bring in these technologies of pest and disease resistance and improved nutrient efficiency in many of the developing world crops. And one of the things that happened when we released Bt corn, which is resistant to many corn insects like corn borer, is that we found that these corns are not only healthier against insects, but they were also much more much free from many of the fungal infections that normally happens when there is a damage to the corn kernels. And one important observation that came out of that is that the genetically modified corn that we grow in the United States has 30-fold less toxin. And so one of the toxins is called fumonisin, which causes neural tube defects in children, because when the pregnant mother eat this corn, that is fairly toxic, and the genetically modified corn is relatively free of these toxins. And so when you see a corn kernel, the cob that is genetically engineered, you can easily tell the one that is not, especially that is grown where we don't control any pests with using even pesticides. The difference is day and night. And so biotechnology not only helps us give better increased food production, but also better quality food production, because it can help eliminate some of the toxins. One other important example we have in the United States here today is papaya, a fruit that is grown in Hawaii, an important fruit in Hawaiian agriculture, and much of this papaya was destroyed by a virus called papaya ring spot virus in the 80s. And Cornell scientist Dr. Dennis Gonzalez developed a genetically engineered variety of papaya by putting a gene from the virus itself into the plant, and developed a very healthy papaya. Now practically all the papaya that we grow in Hawaii, and even that gets exported to places like Japan today, is genetically modified. And it is one other great example of how a simple alteration of a gene in a crop has helped save farmers who would not have otherwise planted papaya in Hawaii, and hopefully in many other countries such as in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and Thailand, where papaya is an important food crop, not just a fruit crop. It is going to make even bigger difference. And as we move forward with this technology, some of the other applications that we might see in the developing world is to see how we can keep the fruits and vegetables fresh longer. We call it as a longer shelf life. You see, when you harvest a tomato here, you can keep it at the most, even in a refrigerator, for about a week or two. And then, as you know, the tomatoes just ripen, and then they become very soft, and then they are not edible. But on the other hand, we have a way of slowing down by using very precise, targeted biotechnology tools. We can silence some of the genes related to ripening in tomato or papaya or in mango. In that way, we can develop fruits and vegetables that can be stored right at a room temperature of 3 months, 4 months. And this has been shown to work in the laboratory conditions. And hopefully, we'll see that going beyond the lab and being developed in many fruits and vegetable crops in the developing world. And that means farmers will be able to transport it to larger distances to get a better markets, and also consumers will see prices coming down because of the low perishability of the product. And one other very important application in my mind the biotechnology will have in the future is to how it can help develop hardier crops that can help withstand the drought condition when there is not too much rain, which is very common in across the globe, and which can withstand heat and even cold. And so all of these are elements of climate change that many experts believe is going to impact agriculture in a very negative manner because of the almost the chaotic nature of the changes that we can expect. And one of the most important tools we have in our hand to help insulate our agriculture and our farming against the vagaries of climate change is this tool of biotechnology, which includes developing transgenic plants, but also other tools such as genomics and bioinformatics, which help us to understand more about why some plants deal with cold better. You can plant crops almost in the sub-zero temperatures, and they tolerate well, and how we can learn from some of these plants and how they tolerate cold or heat or even withstand drought or submerging, and how we can transfer some of those traits into our crop plants or even turn on those genes that are already present in our crop plants. And so there's some really exciting opportunities as we move forward because of the tremendous explosion in knowledge and understanding of plant biology that's happening. For instance, here in Professor Goldberg's lab at UCLA is a pioneer in understanding of how plants work and trying to clone and gain insights into the biology of many plant genes. And so we have many instances of such successes, and recently in Alabama, they planted some eucalyptus trees, which would normally never grow in Alabama, and they were able to withstand the frost because of some of the freezing tolerance genes that they had put in. And another example that I wanted to bring to your attention is how we can improve the nutrition of a lot of food crops that we grow today. In that way, we can alter them to be more wholesome, with improved protein composition, higher protein content, even higher vitamin content. A great example of that is a golden rice that was developed in a lab in Switzerland and now being transferred to many of the developing countries such as Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam, and India. You see, rice does not have any vitamin A or provitamin A at all, the rice grains, and thus genes from maize or corn were transferred into rice, and these rice started looking yellow or golden in color, and they also secrete vitamin A precursor, and that way a small bowl of rice eaten would be enough to meet the really daily recommended allowance of vitamin A, and might bring a major impact in many developing countries, because today, because of vitamin A deficiency, many thousands of children go blind every year, and almost 1 million children die because of lack of vitamin A that predisposes them to many other diseases, and that can be averted with the use of this technology. And there's also the technology is being used to help produce pharmaceutical proteins in plants, which is of great relevance to developing countries in controlling infectious diseases, and even developing new sources of energy, biofuels. Instead of using our food crops to grow ethanol, perhaps we can grow some of the hardier shrubs and trees and grasses that are grown in marginal soils in the developing world, and use them to produce biofactories, biofuel, but also other components used in industry. And so there is a considerable amount of research going on in many developing countries, including Africa, where there, for instance, laboratories are working on improving sweet potato, trying to make it resistant to virus. And in our own laboratory in Tuskegee, we have developed sweet potatoes that have a higher protein content, and we are in the process of transferring this technology to Ghana and to test those plants over there. Another institute in Ibadan, Nigeria, is developed cowpeas that are resistant to pests, so that West African farmers especially depend on cowpea as a major source of protein, and would be able to grow it in a much more cleaner and high productive manner. And as at Danforth Center in St. Louis, for instance, is working on cassava to develop a type of cassava that is resistant to an important virus that is killing many cassava plants in Africa, called African cassava mosaic virus. And banana or plantain is another important staple food, especially in East Africa. And much of this banana is threatened by a disease, a fungal disease called Sigatoka disease. And again, a lab in Belgium is collaborating with a laboratory in Uganda, and they have helped develop certain strains of banana that is resistant to this fungi, and are right now are testing to see if this banana proves useful in the field. And I mentioned drought tolerance earlier, and I want to again re-emphasize that, because drought, water deficit, is one of the major factors historically of causing famine in many developing countries. And countries in southern Africa, the past few years have seen a recurring drought almost every year. And an important development against this is a company here in the United States has developed drought-tolerant corn, which our American farmers would be planting for the first time this year. Has a really an amazing ability to tolerate 2-3 weeks of complete dry weather with no rain or irrigation, and where a normal corn would not be able to withstand that in a manner. And what is interesting is that this technology has been transferred to an agency, a non-profit foundation in Africa, where the drought-tolerant genes are being integrated into the white maize that Africans grow, because in Africa they don't necessarily eat the kind of maize that we eat here in the United States. And hopefully in a few years, the African farmers would be growing this drought-tolerant maize. And maize is the number one food crop in Africa, and any help in improving productivity of maize would be good. And there's also one other trait that is being targeted for change in maize varieties in Africa, is to make it resistant to a very nasty weed called striga or witchweed that kills a lot of maize plants in Africa because it simply grows on the plant directly, and I've seen fields sometimes completely destroyed by this weed that produces very beautiful purple flowers. And by just treating with this with a chemical, it's kind of like 50 cents per acre additional expense, and now farmers are able to control the germination of these weed seeds along with the seed and able to develop a much healthier crop of maize, which gives almost 3 or 4 times the yield with such a small investment. So I do believe as we move forward, we are going to see many other crops in the developing world that are transformed by biotechnology. Most important of that is going to be obviously wheat, rice, but also many vegetables that are such an important source of nutrients, vitamins, antioxidants in our food, and they could be engineered to grow better in a more productive manner with less use of chemicals and able to tolerate drought, heat and cold, and also fruits that are less perishable. And then one of the interesting applications of biotechnology came about recently is in that a company in Australia developed a blue rose. And I mention this because much of the flowers that you find in the flower market share, or when you order flowers for delivery to your friend in a Valentine's Day or whatever, much of them are grown in the developing world. Countries like Kenya and India and Guatemala grow these flowers, and there's a lot of work going on in genetic engineering. An interesting example I came across is this development of blue rose, and even a much dark blue rose one could even call it a black rose, by taking genes from petunia and putting it into rose. They have developed that, and you could buy this rose already now in Japan, and hopefully in the United States soon too. Okay, now I want to come to the part of genetic engineering which goes beyond technology. While I've talked about so many instances of biotechnology that could be of use to genetic in the developing world, none of that will be seen when it will be brought into the market if there is no acceptance of this technology. In other words, a major reason why we have not seen biotechnology products in other countries, including Europe, today is because of certain skepticism and even apprehension of this technology in the certain quarters of the society. And so, naturally, when you talk about biotechnology, genetically modified food, one of the first questions people ask me is this food safe? And so, to answer that question, that so far, every product that has been introduced into the market using biotechnology has been very safe. We have grown these crops around the world for the past 15 years, planted cumulatively on more than 2 billion acres. And if you walk into a typical supermarket in the US, you probably find about 25,000 products containing biotechnology ingredients or used from crops modified through biotechnology. And we have not had a single instance of any harm to the food or feed or from an environmental point of view. The reason is that there is, as I mentioned earlier, there is substantial testing, safety testing that goes on, and there is also considerable oversight of this technology by many federal agencies, including U.S. Department of Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration, and Environmental Protection Agency, but also because much of our food is exported, and many other food safety agencies in Europe, in Japan, and Korea, all oversee the development of this crop. So there's considerable safety factor built into it, right from the point when we conceive this product. We ensure as to it is safe, as to where do we get this gene from, what do we know about the kind of proteins that it encodes, and when we develop this crop, we make literally dozens and dozens of studies to see what is the behavior, the performance of this crop, the agronomic traits, the morphological traits, and then what is the composition of this biotech crop compared to the non-biotech crop. Is there any changes in the nutrients? Are there any changes in any chemicals? More specifically, we want to make sure that there are no new allergens introduced into biotech crops because of introduction of the foreign genes into that, and that there is no new allergenicity, any inadvertent emergence of allergenicity in the food that we feed. And we also feed this biotechnology derived food products into many animals. It's because much of it goes into livestock. We feed it to the cow and the pigs and the poultry and the sheep, and we do a lot of scientific observations to make sure that there are no significant differences in the body weight and milk composition, digestibility, and many other factors related to the livestock production, but also to make sure that there are no deleterious negative effects of use of these products from a safety point of view. And so there has been literally hundreds of studies, scientific studies done on that safety of this, and almost all of them show that biotechnology derived food is safe and is as safe as conventionally developed food, and in many instances it's even safer because of the elimination of the toxins and the better healthier produce that we see. And beyond food safety, we also ask many environmental questions to see if these biotechnology derived crops, do they have any issues related to what is their effect on biodiversity on the farm, their effect on the native flora, and what is the effect on microbial composition of the soil, and is there any gene flow issues? In other words, are there any escape of pollen from biotech crop into neighboring fields where there may be weeds, or if there are some weeds are cross compatible with these crops. We don't want to have any instances where the weeds, for instance, gain herbicide tolerant genes and become weedier themselves. And so there is quite considerable regulatory testing built into these crops, so much so that this has been an important factor in even delaying or constraining the development of biotech crops. For instance, if the biotechnology trait is already developed, it may just cost only $1 million or $2 million to develop a new variety of a particular crop, but it will take anywhere from $20 million to $100 million to get it through the regulatory system. And so as we move forward, I do believe that some of these regulations, which are right now very onerous and burdensome, will come down, especially in developing countries, because the cost of development of this technology is reduced. Then more and more countries, and especially resource poor countries, will be able to use it. And that's very important in terms of the public perception and how policymakers perceive this technology, because we have had instances in Zambia in about 7 or 8 years ago, when there was a very serious drought and also an impending famine. The president of that country nevertheless still said that I don't want my people to eat any genetically engineered food, and so stopped the inflow of the food aid coming from America into Zambia. While it's a very sad instance where people were starving, and yet a lot of food was withheld in the warehouses. So much so that many of them just ransacked the warehouse and took the food anyway. But what is important to recognize is that a lot of fears about this technology, and even the myths and the misinformation that has been orchestrated again, this technology has done a lot of damage in preventing many of these developing countries from accessing this technology, and also the delay. See, for instance, the golden rice was developed almost 12, 15 years ago, and yet we have not seen the commercialization of this golden rice into the farm fields in Asia because of the very long regulatory process that we have. I do believe as we move forward, many of the governments across in the developing world will recognize the value of this technology. And there are many agencies, such like the Gates Foundation, for instance, helping to to fund some of the developments of this technology in a very meaningful manner, and to see how they can responsibly integrate into the current breeding methods, and so that in future we will have many elite varieties coming out of the labs in Africa and other labs in Asia, such as virus-resistant cassava and sweet potato, improved sorghum with a high nutritive value, and examples like that that could really help third world agriculture improve their food and nutritional security, improve their crop productivity, and so this is really what we're talking about, is that truly a sustainable agriculture. In agriculture that where we what we practice today with a lower ecological footprint, in a way that we do not impact the natural resources in a negative manner, so much so that we want to make sure that while we grow food today, we do not affect the ability of our children and grandchildren to grow the same food in a responsible manner without having to cut down any new forests and to bring them into farming like we have done recklessly in the past many years, and also to see how we can responsibly harness the tremendous potential of this technology to produce better quality food with more nutrition. In that way, it is not just a small section of the population, global population, can enjoy the benefits of this technology, but really the vast population that is currently needs the assistance of this and many other tools to improve their food production and to bring about a transformational change in how we produce food and the quality of food that we produce. And in ending, I want to leave you all with a parting thought on when you look into the history of food production, and especially the technologies in the food, they have not been readily accepted. While we want, we readily accept the most recent innovative cell phones or computers or cars or even medicines. There is a ready acceptance of new technology. In food, unfortunately, it has not been so historically. If you look at canning that was invented during the time of Napoleon, it took almost 100 years before food cans were accepted. And the same thing with the pasteurization, which was developed by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. It was in 1947 when the first pasteurization came into mandatory pasteurization was enforced in Chicago. And there is always going to be some vested interest that is trying to come in the way of implementation of innovations and new technology, and there's also natural reluctance on the part of people. But over time, I do believe when society understands the benefits the new technology can bring, and also has a greater familiarity with any of the risks and unforeseen problems with this technology, when they feel more comfortable with that, I do believe that technology will move forward, and so would this biotechnology, or the so-called GMOs, will be accepted by the greater society in a way that it would help bring great benefit to the people, and not only that much of the population would live longer, but also live better. Thank you very much.